everybody. Welcome back to another week of Cutthroat Commander. I'm your host, Tim, and this week we'll be featuring Thada, Adel, Inquisitor as our commander. Before I get into the deck tech, however, I would like to thank everyone who left feedback. I have managed to take some of the feedback into mind. I think I've managed to fix my microphone settings so it comes through a little louder. And also, a friend suggested that rather than record videos while I am playing them, that I might be better off recording over the replays of those games. And for a lot of reasons, I decided that's probably a good idea, so you'll see a change in that this week. I've also managed to update a few spots on the YouTube page where people thought things were lacking. And all I can say is thanks for the feedback. Keep it coming. I will note that there weren't any overly negative comments, which is a minor miracle on YouTube, so thank you all for keeping it civil. And as I said before, I'm very new to recording, so if you have constructive criticism, I'd love to hear it, and I'll try and take advantage of it when I can. So going into Thada, Adel, Inquisitor, I've picked this general for a variety of reasons. For starters, I'm not really sure I guess, is a very powerful commander for a couple reasons. One, mana ramp is strong in this format, and he gives blue mana ramp in a sense, which is something you don't normally get access to. Second is, I've talked a little bit about some of the metagame and the nature of deck building in 1v1 Commander on Magic Online. And part of that is that, unlike French or Dual Commander offline, cards like Soul Ring, Mana Vault, Mana Crypt, and things of that nature are not prohibited, meaning virtually every deck you're playing against has at least a Soul Ring, and a lot of the more competitive decks also have Mana Crypt and Mana Vault. Meaning, even if their deck doesn't really focus on artifacts, chances are there's still a very high-powered card that you can grab out of their deck. Being able to essentially tutor for cards that should be banned out of an opponent's deck is a very strong ability, and one that tends to snowball. On the flip side, sometimes you do come across decks, of course, that just have nothing for you. I, for instance, was playing a Mimeoplasm deck where the only artifacts in their deck were the 3 signets, which did a little good, but not exactly the payoff you're looking for. The other important thing about Thada Adel is that it hates on blue. I don't think I've discussed this yet, but blue is probably, without a doubt, the best color in Commander, with by a fair margin, I would say. That's not to say other colors are bad. There are colors that match up well against blue. There are colors that are powerful, but like in the rest of Magic, blue has some effects that are very difficult to overcome and very powerful in Commander. So, almost all the decks I play are blue. I will showcase some that aren't to illustrate how you can get around having to play blue, but it also means that a huge chunk of the metagame you're playing against is blue. The 5 videos I've recorded for you to upload, 1, 2, 3, several, most of them are against blue decks. I think there's a mono green deck, and that's about it. And Thada Adel is very good at hating on them. Island Walk is good. A lot of blue decks, especially if they're heavy blue, also play a lot of artifacts. So Thada Adel gives you an edge against those decks. And the metagame is so heavily blue-centric that you can often take advantage of it through commanders like this, without going totally overboard by playing something like Lauen's Cephalid Empress, or something that's just going to be dead in other matchups. Another good choice if you do like mono blue commanders and you're looking to hate on blue, Teferi is another good choice that shuts down blue decks. This deck originally, before extensive retooling, was a Teferi deck, or Teferi, depending on how you like to pronounce it. But for right now, we're going to show how to build around Thada Adel Inquisitor. So, as I mentioned, pros of this deck: it's powerful, it hates on blue, and most of all, it's interactive. It might not feel that way to your opponent, but yes, you're ramping up and casting giant spells, but at the same time, you do have answers to universally problematic permanents, which is something that blue can struggle with. You don't have answers to everything at all times, but chances are you can scrounge up a way to get to victory with the right line of play. Cons, of course, are the usual cons you see from mono blue. Spot removal is pretty terrible. I've thought about putting a rapid hybridization or Pongify in here. I haven't yet. I haven't really needed to, but that might be something that needs to be incorporated. Decks that go wide, tokens, things like that can be very difficult to deal with. You only have so many, you don't really have any sweeper effects. You only have a couple mass bounce effects, and you kind of got to save your bullets in that regard. And then finally, the nature of this deck makes it extremely vulnerable to hate cards or artifact removal. If someone blows up all artifacts or casts something like Stony Silence, you might be in for a bit of a bad day. And then finally, there are decks that are just hyper aggressive, and this deck can have a hard time dealing with them. Some that come to mind include some of the red decks. Perforos is one of them that I'll actually be talking about later today if I have time to record another video. Krenko, Mob Boss, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Those can get off to a fast start and cause issues for this deck. Having discussed the pros and cons, let's talk about card choices a little. First up, we have basic lands. 19 islands in this case. This deck does not play a ton of lands total. It plays 33. However, at least one of the non-basics doesn't actually tap for mana, so 32 lands. And it gets by with that because A, it plays a bunch of mana rocks, and B, it plays a bunch of cantrips and card draw. So I haven't had too many issues with this. Sometimes you've got to take chances on hands to get there, but all in all, it's pretty good. This is heavily island focused for a couple reasons. One is you play some cards that care about having non-basic islands, and I'll get to those later in the deck tech. Makes your mana base more resilient, and in general, and it also allows you to utilize fetch lands pretty heavily. However, being monocolored, there is plenty of room for utility lands. To start off, we have some basic fetch lands. We have Evolving Wilds, we have Scalding Tarn, Flooded Strand, Misty Rainforest, Polluted Delta, and yeah, so we have the 4 Zendikar / Onslaught fetch lands and an Evolving Wilds. Now, the reason you even play fetch lands like this is threefold. First, they interact with Crucible of Worlds, where is it? Which will allow you to keep replaying those from your graveyard. Second, they interact well with Delve, Treasure Cruise, and Dig Through Time. And third, they interact as shuffle effects. You have Sensei's Divining Top, you have Jace the Mind Sculptor, you have Brainstorm, right there. These help you shuffle away excess cards that you don't need, because there are some situational cards in here that are pretty terrible in certain matchups that they don't line up well against. Next up on utility lands, you have Ancient Tomb and Temple of the False God. Both just 2 mana lands. They don't help you cast your commander any sooner unless you go like turn 1 Ancient Tomb into Mana Rock, but they are good at ramping up and casting some of your more expensive spells a turn early. Next up, we've got Thawing Glaciers. A lot of these games end up being grinds, especially if you're in a blue-on-blue control match. And if you're in an aggressive matchup, there's nothing worse than having to go like turn 1 or 2 Thawing Glaciers, because it, much like the name suggests, it's just so slow. For those of you who've never seen this card, you play it tapped. The next turn you can pay 1 and tap it to put a tapped basic land into play and return it to your hand. So every other turn, you can spend 1 mana and a land drop essentially to fetch a basic out of your deck tapped. But there are grindy matchups that card really shines against. Next up on the utility lands, sorry, the slide rule here is bothering me. Cavern of Souls, which basically makes your commander or other creatures uncounterable if you name the right type. There's a little bit of dyssynergy here. This is the only Merfolk rogue, or either actually for that matter, in the deck, except Talrand is a Merfolk, I believe. So in general, if that Adel is important, you name that. If he's not going to be important, or you just don't think you're going to get through, Wizard is usually another good call, because that gains you unfettered access to Teferi, to Venser, to Talrand, and to Snapcaster Mage. And Glenelender Archmage, however you want to pronounce it. All right. Going along with Cavern of Souls is Beside You, which, for those of you who don't know, pay 2 life, you add a mana to your mana pool, and it makes your instants or sorceries uncounterable. This doesn't come up as often as you'd like, but when it really matters, when you're casting your massive effects that we'll go over later, Time Walk effects, Cyclonic Rift, it's really good to know absolutely that spell will resolve. Next up, Riptide Laboratory. This is kind of a holdover from when this was a Teferi deck. However, there are enough targets in here that it is still worth running. As I mentioned, there are several wizards. Glenelender Archmage, Venser, Snapcaster Mage, Talrand, and Teferi. Those are all important enough that you want to keep them in play, or they have effects like Snapcaster Mage or Venser where you can just repeatedly abuse those effects. Definitely a land worth running. Next up, we have Strip Mine and Wasteland. They're extremely useful. You do have Crucible Worlds to put even more pressure on their mana base. And oftentimes, I've talked before about the various uses of these. It's not just for screwing your opponent out of mana. A lot of times they're used to put your opponent off mana at the right time to force a spell through. Or to get rid of a problematic land like Mesa Ith that will completely shut down your general. Finally, I mentioned a land that doesn't tap for mana, Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale. You don't play a lot of creatures, and the ones you do play are high impact enough that paying 1 is not a big deal. This is one of your few outs against token-based strategies. This can make it very difficult for them to keep those tokens in play. All in all, it's cheap, it's worth having, and it rarely impacts your game plan too much. Oh, it's also worth noting that it provides a sack outlet with Vidalcan Shackles. If you want to keep stealing their creatures, you simply sack it to the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale trigger. Alright. Next up, we have Counter Magic. This deck is mono blue. It does play Counter Magic. It doesn't play as much Counter Magic as you might expect. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 is enough that you can probably have a piece of Counter Magic for what you're looking to get rid of. However, you don't have enough that you can just sit there and counter every spell they play, unless you just get really lucky and can just tempo them out. So we play basically the best or most efficient ones. Leading off that is the most powerful piece of Counter Magic in the format, and that's Mana Drain. I talk about this when it comes up in some videos. This card is just incredibly unfair. It prevents a lot of opponents from doing anything because they play scared or can't afford to give you 5 or 6 extra mana on their turn. Decks with big dumb things, ramp and big dumb things, you can basically just sit there, let them ramp, and just wait for them to cast something into this. And you, unlike a lot of blue decks, have a lot of things you can do with that mana. You do have a lot of high cost spells we'll go over later on. Sorry. Backing that up, you have Counterspell, efficient and counters everything. You have Remand, which is great for tempo and helps dig you into your deck, cantrips. You have Disdainful Stroke, which in Commander is going to counter most cards that will actually ruin your day. There's a few things that are problematic that slip under it, something like Necropotence, but this will at least take care of most of what you need it to do. Negate is another thing that will just, no questions asked, take down a lot of truly scary spells, things like Tooth and Nail or Genesis Wave or Mind Twist. Glenelender Archmage, I don't think I really need to say anything about this. It's basically 2 negates tacked onto a body. The nice thing about this is once you do get it into play, it basically ensures you win counterfights because they have no way of countering these effects. However, it doesn't hit creatures, so keep that in mind. And then finally, I joke, don't leave home without these two if you're playing blue. Misdirection and Force of Will. Hopefully you all know what Force of Will does. Misdirection comes up less often. You can exile a blue card to cast it for free and change the target of a spell. These are extremely essential because a lot of times you will have to tap out with this deck, and it's always good knowing you have a safety net behind you to do so. That if you tap out for that Eldrazi or that Omniscience, your opponent can't easily get rid of it. Also, misdirection. Force of Will is more generally useful, but misdirection in a few corner cases. A, it's as close to a second Force of Will as you're going to get without, say, Pact of Negation. And B, it can really wreck some opponents who play some very nasty spells against you. There's nothing more satisfying than misdirecting a Mind Twist back at somebody. Some other key spells that you can misdirect are some of the card draw spells like Ancestral Vision. Some but not all of the Time Walk effects, the ones that say target player. It can also be used, if you know how to do it right, as another counterspell against other counterspells. You force them to target the misdirection with the misdirection, which does work because it's on the stack at the time. Misdirection resolves, and then the other spell fizzles. It's especially good against counterspells that cannot be countered, like Counterflux, or counterspells that give them some sort of other benefit, like drawing a card, where you can make them fizzle by this whole spell doesn't resolve because the misdirection is no longer on the stack. Alright, so there's your counter magic. Next up, we have Mana Rocks. And these categories are somewhat loose. Some of these cards can easily be classified in other categories. The Mana Rocks are pretty standard. You have Mana Crypt and Soul Ring. You will rarely see me, if ever, play Commander deck without these in them. You also have some of the more popular ones, Mana Vault. You have Gilded Lotus. You have Therian Dynamo for 3 mana. Worn Power Stone. And then you get into some of the more esoteric ones. Sky Diamond's just a 2 mana rock with color. Mox Diamond helps you play turn 2 Thada Adel a lot. Sapphire Medallion is, it doesn't look like it, but it's essentially a 2 mana rock. Almost like a 2 mana Mind Stone until you start casting multiple spells a turn. Mind Stone itself. Coalition Relic, which is very nice. Allows you to ramp from 3 mana to 6 mana. Caged Sun, which gets your blue mana completely out of control and can allow you to quickly cast multiple big spells in a turn. And finally, I classified Crucible Worlds as a mana rock. It basically has 2 functions. One is to just knock opponents out of the game through Strip Mine or Wasteland. The other more common thing you do with it, however, is just repeatedly playing fetch lands again and again and again to thin your deck and just steadily build your mana without actually having to use cards out of your hand, which can build up a tremendous amount of card advantage over time. Next up, we have the Planeswalker Suite. Ugin is also kind of a win condition. It's one of the very few board sweepers you have. It's great against things like tokens. It's great against things like these Enchantress decks that try and kind of create a prison-like network of enchantments. And it's great at locking some of the smaller commanders off the board with the +2. It's also, now that I'm looking at this deck, I realize the only life gain in the deck, and even calling it life gain is a little dubious considering only his ultimate gains you life. After that, we have a few Jaces. Jace the Mind Sculptor, obviously great. I don't think I need to explain why that card is in here. Jace Memory Adept, which is just a nice repeated card draw source. Jace Balerion, also repeated card draw and significantly cheaper. And Tezzeret the Seeker, As you know, this deck obviously plays a lot of mana artifacts, and this can help ramp up to a very large amount. It is minus X ability usually either grabs, something like a Mana Crypt, a Soul Ring, a Coalition Relic, or depending on the matchup, the only other real artifact you're going to need to fetch with some regularity is a Vedalken Shackles, a Crucible of Worlds, or against certain very specific decks, Relic of Progenitus. Sorry, my throat's a little sore. And then finally you have Tameo. Tameo is okay, it locks down a permanent. It's not as good as the others, but its ultimate is almost always good game. And combined with Time Warp effects, obviously you want to maximize the number of Planeswalkers you have. One card that's not in here, simply due to card availability reasons, is I have not yet obtained a Jace Vryn's Prodigy. Last I checked, the card I believe is 70 tickets online, and I'm not that desperate for one yet. I don't play a lot of constructed competitive formats, so I can afford to just kind of wait until that gets a little more reasonable in price, maybe after it rotates. Alright, next up, card draw / card selection. And this comes in a few different categories. To begin with, we have actual tutors. Mystical Tutor, not banned in this format, banned in 1v1, but we get to take advantage of that. It sets up also nicely with certain miracle cards, Devastation Tide and Temporal Mastery. After that, we have Merchant Scroll. Merchant Scroll is almost always searching for one of a couple different cards. Either Mana Drain, if you just need a hard counter that will generate mana advantage. Force of Will. If you really need card advantage, Dig Through Time is an option. And then the final thing you might grab is something like Cyclonic Rift or Capsize if you're really desperate to get rid of a problematic permanent. After that, the only other thing I would call a tutor is Bribery. I didn't really have a good category to fit that into. It's really just a good value spell that obviously tutors for a creature out of your opponent's deck. Against some decks, this is Against other decks, this card is backbreaking. Usually big green decks are playing all sorts of fun stuff to grab out of their deck. And I hear a lot of people complain about this card, like, oh, that's so unfair. The thing is, you can build with this in mind. It's only as unfair as the cards your opponent is playing. For instance, my Animar deck does not have Terastodon, and part of that was I got sick of it being cloned or briberied endlessly. So I made a decision, take it out. Eldrazi, yeah, you can grab them, but they don't get the trigger. The card's only as busted as the cards you play in your own deck, so don't complain too much about it. As far as raw card, and Fabricate's the final tutor. This replaced Trinket Mage. I realize that the 2/2 body on it is not as important as being able to grab either a bigger mana rock like Gilded Lotus or Cage Sun, or some sort of utility artifact like Crucible Worlds or Vedalken Shackles. So out goes Trinket Mage, in comes Fabricate. Future Sight doesn't say draw a card, but over the course of a game it will draw you cards. You'll see some of the blue mirror matches that this card is pretty much single-handedly responsible for winning them. Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise should probably be in virtually every blue deck. They're so powerful. Commander, you fill the graveyard at a rapid enough pace that these are just great ways to refill your hands. There aren't a lot of replacements for these. Stroke of Genius. Instant speed card draw at the end of turn is nice. It's not the most efficient rate compared to some of these other cards, but in the end, you'll often appreciate being able to end step that to force an answer or force your opponent to do something, and it allows you to maintain flexibility in the way a sorcery speed in card draw spell would not allow you to. Same thing with Impulse, a little bit of card selection. For those of you who've never seen this, this is Anticipate, only 4 cards instead of 3. Preordain, Ponder, and Brainstorm are the trifecta, the best trifecta of cantrips in blue. If you don't know what those are, feel free to look those up. Ancestral Vision, Ancestral Recall that comes out 4 turns later. A great early play, and these games drag on enough that even if you draw at turn 3, 4, 5, it's still good. Sensei's Divining Top, Some games it feels like you're just spinning water and spending a bunch of mana doing nothing. However, in the drawn out games, having this and your opponent not is probably going to win you the game. And we'll see at least one game in these videos where I would say that Sensei's Divining Top single-handedly beat them. Next up, we have what I just classified as utility creatures. Consecrated Sphinx just draws a bajillion cards. Always good in a blue deck. Same with Muldrifter, just draw some cards. Talrand, you play just enough instants and sorceries probably to make this worth it. You don't go super deep on it the way that the dedicated Talrand decks do, that will play every cantrip and every cheap counter magic or bounce spell to gain this advantage. However, it is decent. This is probably going to be the first to get cut if I grab another card to go into this deck. There's a few cards kind of on the fence that I feel might be better than this. So if you're looking to start cutting from the deck, this would probably be your best bet. For those of you who don't know what it does, 2/2 for 4, Merfolk Wizard. When you cast an instant or sorcery spell, 2/2 blue Drake with flying on the battlefield. Phyrexian Metamorph. I wanted a clone effect. This one gives the most flexibility with its Sculpting Steel ability to copy artifacts as well. The fact it doesn't require blue makes it easy to cast off some of these mana rocks. Like there have been several times where I've gone Thran Dynamo into Metamorph copying another Thran Dynamo. Venser Shaper Savant. Basically can bounce any problematic permanent you have. And a pinch, it can act as a remand sort of effect. Not overly great at any one thing, but very useful, very versatile. So I recommend having it. And also if you can get it going with Riptide Laboratory, that can be extremely annoying to deal with. Snapcaster Mage, obviously one of the best blue cards in Magic. Certainly one of the best ones legal for Commander. Depends what you need. You need to Snapcaster Cantrip to get ahead? Sure. You need to Snapcaster a Time Walk effect to get another turn? Sure. You need to Snapcaster Counter Magic? Sure. Whatever you need, it's there for you. Next up, we have a column that I'm just calling answer cards because they don't really fit into another category. They're mainly designed to counter something that an opponent is doing. Teferi helps shut down other blue decks, as well as, I think I talked about this in Animar, he also shuts down some very specific, powerful strategies that are played in Commander. Suspend and Cascade. So if you're playing against Maelstrom Wonder or Jwaru the Gitu, this is your only efficient answer to those cards. Also in the blue-on-blue matchups, this is a very powerful card. They're required to respond to it when you cast on their end step, or else they're just going to get locked out of your turn, and you're free to do whatever you want. So don't leave home without it for the blue mirrors. Confiscate. It's a basically control magic effect. However, unlike control magic or treachery or some of the other effects out there, this isn't as efficient, but it can grab absolutely anything. Is it an enchantment giving you problems? Is it a planeswalker giving you problems? It's worth noting that this deck is not the greatest at dealing with planeswalkers. So this at least allows you to grab a planeswalker, even when it's about to ultimate sometimes. For those of you who've played with Zealous Conscripts, you'll know full well the power of stealing an opponent's ultimate ready planeswalker. It certainly feels good. Devastation Tide is a bounce spell for all permanents on both sides. It has the ability to miracle for 1 and a blue. So you can accomplish a few miracle tricks with this. You can wipe the board for very cheap. The problem with doing it in your upkeep is it makes floating mana very difficult. Sometimes with some of these mana rocks, like the Soul Rings, the Mana Crypts, and the Mana Vaults, you can actually generate mana using Devastation Tide by tapping it and then bouncing it and then replaying it. It's one of the few hard resets you have to board, so use it wisely. Your other hard reset is Cyclonic Rift. Anyone watching this video in Commander probably knows what Cyclonic Rift does. It's played in virtually every blue deck. And it's worth noting that this can be fetched with Merchant Scroll, unlike Devastation Tide. Propaganda, I mentioned tokens give this deck problems. Propaganda can buy you a lot of times against that deck. Capsize, late in the game when you can afford to buy it back, or even buy it back twice, can help deal with basically anything out there. Do watch out. One way you can stop buyback is it getting countered, or the permanent that you're targeting getting removed. Those can kind of fish it out of your hand. It's also important to note, if you're playing against Capsize, is find a way to remove the permanent in response to the trigger, and buyback will not work. Also, one interaction to note, off Omniscience. I believe the way it works, you cast Capsize, the Capsize part of it for free, but you do have to pay for the buyback. So every 3 mana you have, you can cast Capsize. Back to basics. This card is nuts. You think Blood Moon is bad. This card banned normally in French Duel Commander. However, in Magic Online, no one pays attention to that ban list, so here we are. There's certain decks that this is great against. It barely affects your mana base. Almost all your non-basics are lands that are either just fetch lands that it's not affected by, or you don't worry too much about losing. So if you cast Back to Basics, there's a lot of decks that's just game over against. Relic of Progenitus, obviously a fetchable little trinket against graveyard hate, cantrips if you don't need it. And then finally, Vidalcan Shackles. Repeatable Steel is bonkers. This deck plays enough islands, you can grab even fairly large creatures. I think the largest I've ever grabbed personally was maybe a 7/7 or 8/8. Although certainly you can obviously go higher. The dream one day is to grab an Eldrazi. Alright, the next category is, we'll just go with this, Time Walk effects. One of Blue's nice things about it is the ability to play Time Walk effects. In this deck we play the trio of 5 mana effects, Capture of Jin Zhao, Temporal Manipulation, and Time Warp. A lot of times these are just used, it's kind of cantrip, especially if you get an early Thada Adel down that's getting in. Even if you're not casting any other spell that turn, any other major spell, it's good to be able to get Thada Adel in there an additional time, get another mana rock, or another, even if you don't have mana to cast it, sometimes you can just use it to get problematic artifacts out of your opponent's deck, something like a Birthing Pod, or a Whip of Erebos, or just something that you'll never cast, but your opponent might. Time Stretch is one of the big flashy finishers. It's always nice, and it usually is a way you can set up some games to close out against difficult decks by, say, time stretching, followed by Eldrazi, followed by Swing. And then Temporal Mastery, it's expensive, but you can do some miracle tricks with it. I encourage you to watch the video against Madome the Ageless that I post today. It can show you kind of what you can set up with Temporal Mastery to really break one of these games wide open. And then finally, you're playing all these mana rocks, you're playing a way to steal more mana rocks, you're playing a way to stall the game out for several turns. What is it all for? It's for the big flashy spells you get to finish with. You have Ulamog and Kozilek. I've talked before in the Animar video why having these particular Eldrazi are important. There are some nice flashy new ones. The new Ulamog is nice. I would consider playing him in certain decks, maybe even this deck. But these get you several things. First, the cast trigger is always nice against a deck with counter magic. Knowing that you can just cast this, get your benefit. There's nothing they can really do about it. And as an added bonus, they counter it. You get the opportunity to get it back later. Against mill decks, one thing that is important about these versus the new Eldrazi is the shuffling your library, shuffling your graveyard into your library. That occasionally you do come across mill decks, or occasionally you need certain effects back in your library, and that can give you a way to do it. And then finally, Annihilator 4. People don't like Annihilator, but it's definitely there and definitely necessary sometimes to end games that get bogged down into stalemates, or to deal with permanents you don't normally have an answer to. And then some of your other finishers. Jin Gitaxias, Core Augur, for those of you who have never seen this. It's 10 mana, flash, which is nice. At the beginning of your end step, draw 7 cards. At the beginning, and each opponent's maximum hand size is reduced by 7. The importance of this, especially if your opponent's holding up counter magic on your own turn, much like Teferi, it's an end of turn threat on your opponent's turn that they have to answer. Because if they don't, they will usually have to discard their entire hand. So it's a must-answer threat that can open up the ability to resolve one of your other big threats. One interaction that's very common in Commander to watch out for, that I've definitely been caught off guard by before, is Reliquary Tower. Most decks play Reliquary Tower. I almost never play the card, but a lot of other people do. Reliquary Tower completely negates the opponent's hand size restriction on this, because they have no maximum hand size. So you run this out there, think they're going to discard their entire hand, make sure to look to see if they have that land. I know a lot of times it just sits there in the background and no one pays attention to it, but you can really get wrecked if you're not paying attention to that. Right of Replication with Kicker is just always fun, especially if your opponent has something nice and juicy like, I don't know, Terastodon or Acidic Slime or Precursor Golem, I believe was one of my favorites. But all in all, fun card to play. And then finally, Omniscience. Occasionally you resolve Omniscience and you just brick. You don't have any cards in hand and it just sits there, much like if you've ever played the Omnitel deck in Legacy. However, most of the time you're going to get there. You'll find something to do with that ability. As I said before, a few interactions with it. It is from your hand, so you can't cast your General for free. You cannot, your Commander. You cannot cast things off Future Sight for free. And anything with buyback, you actually have to pay the buyback cost. Where's that cap size? I discussed this earlier. Anyway, as I mentioned, there are a few cards that are on the fence that I'm probably going to put in here in place of Talrand. For those of you who want to experiment, some of the cards on the fence are Treachery, which is a 2 blue and 3. Steal target creature, untap 5 lands, or maybe Karn Liberated, or the Baby Jace if you play Standard and actually have access to a copy of it. Anyway, we're going to run through some games. This deck is one of the most powerful that I have built, and you'll see why as you see those games. It's very well suited to preying on the other control-y blue decks in the format. It does have some issues with some of the fast aggro decks, some of the green mid-range decks, unless you draw the right cards, but the format is dominated by blue decks, so this really helps you come into the match with a 1-up on those decks. Hopefully you enjoy the video, and feel free to leave a comment.